Hey, this is Amol from TechLeatherCraft. In this video, I want to replace the old pouch I had hacked together literally in like an hour. This is the pouch I made. I'm going to show you guys how to make this. Also, just keep in mind that the design of this pouch can be scaled up, so no matter what size multi-tool, phone case, whatever you want to make, the principle and design is going to be the same. What you want to do is cut some leather pieces that are about 3/4 inch, maybe half an inch longer in width than the actual material you're using. You want to have a little extra, you can always trim off as you go. Now in this case, I'm using scrap leather because this is a pouch for me. I wasn't too concerned about the look on the back or the front or whatever. So I just picked a bunch of scraps. You can see they're all a little different color. I will be dyeing them, of course, brown. So there's going to be 3 pieces. One is going to be the belt clip section, which is going to be a back piece. And then there'll be the flap, kind of the main back section. And then the third piece will be the front section. This is the section we are going to mold and form for the tool or whatever it is that you're going to be making it for. And in fact, you do want to make the front piece, the part you're going to be wet molding, just a little bit wider than you think you may need. What you want to do initially is dry fit it, kind of wrap it around your multi-tool or whatever it is you're making it for, just to make sure that you have lots of leftover on the side. So I'm going to be wet forming the front section, and I couldn't find anything that was exactly the same width as the flashlight and the multi-tool put together. So I'm going to show you a really quick way to do that. I wet the leather down, and I'm just using the corner of something that I like. So I like the curve that the plastic container had, so I wanted to follow that. It's a nice kind of rounded curve. Basically, you just kind of shift the leather piece around just on the edges, just to get the bend that's needed. We're not going to worry about the bottom part yet. I'll show you how to do that. You're just going to form the curve, shift the leather slightly, and make the curve. If you have, ideally, a block piece of wood that you can actually wet form around, that's a great start. But this is how I'm going to do it. By freehand, I'm just going to flare out the edges. This is why you wanted to make the piece really long. Now, one thing I like to do is also I like to wet form or mold the clip into the back section. This step you don't necessarily need to do. You could just have the leather piece not wet formed to the clip, and it shouldn't be a huge issue. I just kind of like the look. It's a little bit easier to slip in and out. It makes it a little bit of a lower profile. You don't have to necessarily do this, but I like to just wet form it around the clip. Be aware that the clip will leave a little stain depending on the material of the clip. What you want to do is just make sure everything is formed nicely, and you want to just touch up on the edges a little bit. Make sure that the lines have somewhat of a crisp feel to it. Ideally, what you want to do is let both the pieces sit overnight and let them harden. You should end up with a nice stiff leather. Here I am making sure everything is pretty much level. Sometimes when you're wet forming it, the leather can deform a little bit, so it'll be like off tilt a little bit. Don't worry about the edges if they are kind of tapered in a weird way because of the wet forming process. We will go back and trim those up a little bit. Next, I just kind of test the dry fit just to see where the placement would be, see how the flap's going to come over. The flap section, you want to leave a little bit longer, and you'll come back and trim that up. Because I am making this for a small object, I was a little bit worried here that the clip was a little too large for what I was trying to do. And here I'm just dry fitting the tools. So I'm placing them down. I'm making a mark for where the edge is and just how much I want them raised out. And then what I'll do is I'll also make a line for where the gusset will be. So the part that folds over and then the part that's going to tuck back. You'll see what I mean in the video. So next, I'm going to dye the pieces out. I'm dyeing them this Java brown color. It's a really cool effect. It gives this kind of marbled look, which I really like in leather. Next, you're going to buff it, and then you're going to apply a clear coat finish over the top, kind of to water resist it a little bit, and so that the dye doesn't rub off on your clothes or anything. And once again, you ideally want to have the tools or whatever it is you're making it for. So here, I'm trimming up the bottom edges. I'm going to be leaving the back tail section a little long until I figure out exactly the placement for it. Now, some people like to tuck their tail into the actual tool pouch. I don't like to do that because it actually could catch in the tool. So I'm going to be tucking it back. So you do want to make sure everything is perpendicular, things are running parallel. You want to make sure all your cuts and your angles are nice 90-degree cuts. It doesn't always turn out that way when you're assembling it, but you still want to aim for that. And here I'm just forming the leather section of my hand. I personally like to tuck the bottom section back behind the pouch. And what ends up happening is the other leather piece will actually cover that up. Once you have the fold marked out and you know how thick you want the gusset to be in the bottom section, you can mark that out and then align that with the back tab and also mark out on the back panel where that tail will fit. You do also want to be sure you go back and dye and burnish the edges. And now I'm going to sand everything. Now I do go in and sand down the sections that I'm going to be gluing for two reasons. One is to make sure the glue adheres properly, and also it gives it a little bit thinner profile on the edges. It kind of gives it a little bit cleaner look. So I did sand out the entire back panel because that's going to be glued. I did sand down the tail section on both sides to thin it out a little bit, make sure the glue adheres, and also the edges that are going to be forming like the gusset area. So as you get closer to assembly, you do want to be a little bit more precise on your fit. So I'm using little clips to hold everything in position so I can mark out exactly where the glue is going to be. You want to try to get the glue exactly where it needs to be. Once you have the glue line marked out, if you already haven't, you would make sure you want to go and edge dye and burnish the edges. So here it is with the tail glued onto the back section, and I'm just dry fitting again. You can see I sanded right there where the glue would be adhering to the inside. And once again, dry fitting. You do want to keep dry fitting it, just testing it out, make sure the placement of everything is right. And you can trim up things if you need to, depending on if things are overhanging, but I usually like to wait till the end. Now I did burnish and smooth down the top ridge and all the edges, and I also did place the snap, so you want to make sure you do that before you actually glue stuff down. But right now I'm just testing out to see where that pouch will be placed and where the flap will be. Once you have the placement a little bit more fitted, you can determine where to glue everything. Right here I was trying to figure out where exactly I wanted the clip to be and how big I wanted the flap to come up, how much space clearance I wanted. I personally like to rivet the belt clip onto the back panel before gluing it on. That way the metal for the rivet won't be on the inside of the case. Depending on what you're making this for, it may not be a big deal. You could in fact rivet the belt clip on through both layers of leather if you wanted. Be aware that the metal of the rivet will now be in the inside of the case. Depending on what you're making for, this may or may not matter. So I marked that out, placed a little faint line, and I'm putting glue on the entire back section. Once the contact cement has become nice and dry and it's ready to adhere, stick that on there, making sure that you follow the guides and the lines you have drawn. I like to use a little bone folder or creasing tool to make sure I get the clip edges to adhere, and I go back in and hammer. You do want to make sure you trim up and clean up the edges a little bit, and I'm placing this stitch line. Now this isn't going to be the main stitch line. This stitch line is just for me to get a reference on where to start and stop this stitch thread on the bottom. So I'm going to be cutting a groove in there. It's a stitching groove so that your stitches lay flat. This is a really important thing to do if there's going to be a lot of wear in that section. Now with the stitching awl, I actually marked the two edges, and so they show up on the inside, and I marked that out, and I also go back in and cut a groove in there because you don't want the stitches to catch on your tool. Same idea, I'm going to cut a groove into there so the stitching lies flatter. Of course, you can go back and hammer that down. So that's how I make a stitching groove on the opposite end. I use a chisel prong. I'll post the links in the description to these if you're interested. It makes stitching go a lot faster. I did use an awl for the last part because it didn't line up exactly, and I wanted it to meet with the guideline. So I hand stitches together with saddle stitch. If you guys are interested, I can show you guys how to do saddle stitch, but there's lots of videos online. Once you have it all stitched, what I like to do is wet the leather a little bit on the inside and then flatten the stitches down. You can hammer it, you can use a bone folder or a creaser tool. Next, while the case is still open, I'm going to be stitching and securing the belt clip. What you want to do is make sure it's nice and secure so that it doesn't move around. And so I just ran two parallel lines. I didn't do the bottom. You can if you want, but for this video, I wanted to just keep it simple. One thing I like to do, saddle stitching or stitching in general, make sure that the back tack is on the high stress area. So the clip section is a high stress area. Same thing with the edges. When I get to that point, I'm going to be back tacking the opening where it's going to get the most stress, because now there's two layers of threading. You can stitch the clip down, so make sure there's no movement in it, and the clip is nice and secure with a rivet. So you do want to make sure the snap is set, and the best way to do that is to use those clips I showed you early in the video to kind of do a dry fit and then find the center of the case and get that snap placed. So here I glued everything together and I went back and I sanded and cleaned up the edges. You can see I put a little curve on the bottom there too. Before we burnish, you want to make sure you dye the edges because, as I've mentioned in other videos, it's harder for the dye to penetrate into an edge that's burnished, because the whole point of burnishing leather is to make it a little bit more water resistant, make it a little bit stronger. And so you want to make sure you go in and dye the edges. Once you have the edges dyed, then you can go in and burnish and smooth out the edges the best you can. One thing I want to point out here is you've noticed I have not placed a stitch line yet. And this is one of the main mistakes I see with leather crafters, is they'll stitch an edge before they've smoothed and cleaned up the edge. And what they end up doing is they end up running the stitch and then they go back and clean up the edges later. What ends up happening is your stitch line can be really wonky in certain spots. So my advice is always to have the cleanest edge possible, smoothest edge possible, then run the stitch line. I'm going to use the same technique that I showed earlier in the video, using an awl to mark out 2 holes where the stitch line will begin and end, and then cut the stitching groove in. So that is all stitched together. You can see that my back tack ends at the top, so that when there's pressure applied, there's 2 rows of stitching, and the stitching is not likely to fail because there's 2 rows on the back tack. This is especially important when you're saddle stitching, and it is something I do also when I machine stitch, that this higher stress point has the back tack. Next here, I'm just testing out how much clearance I want in the flap. I'm thinking about getting a flashlight with a little clicker on it, so I'm leaving a little bit more clearance for the flap. Once you have that down, you press that down and kind of indent it onto the snap, and you punch the hole. So another quick tip here is I'm going to be making an English point. So one way to make an English point without a punch is to actually make 2 lines that are opposite each other. And then you're going to use your calipers. You're going to use one point as the anchor, and you're going to run a line, a faint tracing along the other edge. And once that's done, you're going to use the other side as an anchor and run the line along that edge. And basically what that does is makes an elliptical. I won't go into the details of it, but this is one way to make an English point if you are interested. This is one of the major points that people like to use for the end of belt tips. You will need to clean it up a little bit. Next, you're going to edge dye the flap, the part you cut out. And basically that's it. So some people don't like English points because they can be kind of catchy. What you can do in that situation is go ahead and use a round curved guide like this and make a curved edge. Anyway guys, thanks for watching. If you're interested in tech, leathercraft, EDC multi-tool reviews, subscribe to my channel. I will have more stuff coming up soon. Be sure to post in the comments if you have any questions or any feedback. Thanks for watching. Take care.